No one expected the house to become so quiet after the funeral. The flowers were still fresh on the table, sympathy cards stacked in neat piles, but the warmth that once lived in every corner was gone. Margaret sat near the window in her dark sweater, staring at the empty garden as if she were waiting for something to move. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching across the silence. She had always been a strong woman, organized, proud, and careful with her emotions, but grief had pressed her shoulders down and stolen the light. From her eyes, Emily noticed the change before anyone else. Daniel, her husband, had returned to work almost immediately. He said staying busy helped him think less. He handled phone calls, legal papers, and bank visits with stiff determination. But he did not sit with his mother long. He did not know how. Emily understood that kind of pain that makes you want to run instead of stay. So she chose to stay. The first afternoon she visited alone. She brought homemade soup. She knocked softly, though she still had her own key. When Margaret opened the door, she forced a small smile. It did not reach her eyes. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot, strands falling around her face. The house behind her looked untouched, like time had stopped. "I thought you might not have eaten," Emily said gently, holding up the container. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, stepping aside anyway. Inside, the air felt heavy. Curtains were half closed. The television was off. The chair where her husband once sat stood empty, angled slightly toward the door as if he might walk back in at any moment. Emily placed the soup in the kitchen and moved quietly, washing dishes that had been left in the sink. Margaret did not protest. She simply watched. They sat together at the dining table. Margaret took a few slow spoonfuls. Emily talked about small things, the grocery store, a neighbor's new puppy, the weather changing. Simple stories to fill space. Margaret nodded but said little. Her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her glass of water. In the days that followed, Emily returned again and again. She cleaned the living room, folded laundry, trimmed the dying roses in the garden. She opened the curtains wide to let light in. Margaret sometimes complained about the brightness, but she did not close them. One evening, while Emily was wiping down the kitchen counter, she heard a soft sound. It was not loud, just a broken breath. She turned and saw Margaret standing by, the sink holding one of her husband's old coffee mugs. Tears rolled down her cheeks silently. She did not wipe them away. Emily walked closer, but did not speak at first. She simply stood beside her. After a moment, she placed her hand gently on Margaret's back. The older woman stiffened, then relaxed. It was the first time she allowed comfort without pulling away. "I don't know who I am without him," Margaret whispered. Emily felt her throat tighten. "You're still you," she replied softly. "You're still strong." Margaret gave a faint, tired smile. Strong people get tired too. That sentence stayed with Emily long after she went home that night. Daniel noticed the extra time she spent with his mother. "You don't have to go every day," he said once, loosening his tie. "She needs space. She needs someone," Emily answered calmly. Daniel sighed. He looked older lately, worry lines deeper around his eyes. He loved his father, but he had always leaned on his mother emotionally. Now he avoided looking at her pain. Emily did not blame him, but she felt the distance growing not just between Daniel and Margaret, but between herself and her husband too. The next week, Margaret surprised Emily. When she arrived, the front door was already open. Soft music played from the living room, an old romantic song from decades ago. Margaret was dusting a bookshelf. "You're early," Margaret said. "I thought I'd help with the garden today." Margaret nodded. "I used to love gardening." They worked side by side outside, pulling weeds and trimming branches. The air was cool, the sky pale blue. For the first time since the funeral, Margaret spoke more than a few sentences. She talked about how she and her husband had planted the rose bushes together when Daniel was 5. She described how they used to argue about where to place the bench under the tree. small memories, spoken with soft laughter. Emily listened carefully. She began to see Margaret not just as her husband's mother, but as a woman who had once been young and hopeful, who had once fallen in love and built a life from scratch. "You think marriage is easy at the start?" Margaret said suddenly, cutting a dry branch. "But it is not." Emily glanced at her. "No, it's not." Margaret looked at her closely then, as if studying her face for something hidden. "You and Daniel are happy." The question felt simple but carried weight. Emily hesitated for half a second before nodding. Yes. Margaret did not look convinced, but she did not press further. That night, when Emily returned home, she watched Daniel from the doorway. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. They spoke about bills and schedules, about ordinary things, but something felt unspoken between them, like a thin layer of glass. She wondered if Margaret had sensed it. Days moved quickly after that. Emily kept visiting. Margaret began waiting for her. She would prepare tea before Emily arrived. They sat by the window together in the afternoons. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, comfortable in each. Others, presents. One rainy evening, thunder rolled across the sky. The lights flickered briefly. Margaret seemed restless, pacing the room. She picked up a photo frame, then set it down again. Her fingers traced the edge of the table as if following an invisible line. "You remind me of myself," she said suddenly. Emily looked up, surprised. "In what way?" Margaret's gaze softened. "You carry more than you should." Emily smiled faintly. "Someone has to." Margaret shook her head. "Be careful. Carrying too much can make you forget your own heart." The words felt heavier than they sounded. Emily felt a strange chill despite the warm room. Margaret sat down slowly. "When I was your age, I believed love was enough. I believed if I gave everything, I would receive everything." "And didn't you?" Emily asked gently. Margaret looked toward the window where rain slid down the glass in thin streams. "Always." There was something in her tone, something unfinished. Emily leaned forward slightly. "You can tell me." Margaret studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust her with something fragile. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the storm grew louder. "I made mistakes," Margaret said quietly, "years ago." Emily's heart began to beat faster. She wasn't sure why. The room felt smaller. "Everyone makes mistakes," she replied carefully. Margaret nodded, but her eyes filled with distant memory. "Some mistakes change how you see yourself." Before Emily could respond, the lights flickered again and the power went out completely. The house fell into darkness except for the faint gray light from outside. Margaret stood up slowly and moved toward a drawer to find candles. Emily helped light them. The soft glow filled the room with shadows. Margaret's face looked different. In candlelight, more vulnerable, less guarded. They returned to the table. The storm outside matched the tension inside. "I never told Daniel," Margaret said suddenly. Emily's breath caught. "Told him what?" Margaret looked down at her hands. Kate trembled slightly. "There are things a mother hides to protect her child," she whispered. "But secrets don't disappear. They wait." Emily felt a wave of uncertainty. She wanted to ask more, but she also feared the answer. She had always seen Daniel's parents as steady, loyal, unbreakable. The idea of hidden cracks unsettled her. Margaret reached across the table and touched Emily's hand gently. Her grip was warm but unsure. "You've been kind to me," she said. "Kinder than I deserve." "That's not true," Emily replied. Quickly, Margaret gave a sad smile. "You don't know that yet." The thunder outside softened, but the tension remained. Emily searched Margaret's face for clarity, but all she saw was hesitation. "There's something you should know," Margaret said finally. Emily's pulse quickened, but just as quickly, Margaret pulled her hand back. "Not tonight." She stood up, blowing out one of the candles. The room darkened further. Emily sat frozen for a moment. Questions filled her mind. What secret could be so heavy after all these years? Why tell her instead of Daniel? And what did it have to do with the way Margaret had been watching her lately? When the power returned, the moment had passed. Margaret moved around the house as if nothing had happened. She thanked Emily for coming and walked her to the door. As Emily stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The air felt cool and clean, but her thoughts were restless. She sensed that something important was about to unfold, something that would not only change how she saw Margaret, but perhaps how she saw her own marriage. Inside the house, Margaret stood by the window again, watching Emily's car disappear. Down the street, her reflection in the glass looked older, softer, almost afraid. For the first time in years, she was thinking about opening a door she had kept locked, and Emily, driving home under the fading storm clouds, had no idea that the next conversation would shake everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the quiet spaces between them. The tension did not fade after that stormy night. It grew. Emily felt it the moment she stepped into Margaret's house the next afternoon. The curtains were open again, but the air still carried something unspoken. Margaret was sitting straight in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she had been waiting for this exact hour. "You came," Margaret said softly. "Of course," Emily replied, placing her bag down. There was no small talk this time, no tea, no talk about the garden. Margaret looked different, determined, almost pale with decision. "Sit with me," she said. Emily obeyed. Her heart beat faster, though she tried not to show it. Margaret inhaled slowly. "I almost told you yesterday." Emily nodded. "I know." Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was heavy, like a door about to open. "I need to say this clearly," Margaret began. "Not to shock you, not to hurt anyone, but because secrets grow louder with age." Emily felt her fingers tighten around the edge of her chair. "When Daniel was a baby, his father and I were not what you think we were." Margaret said. Emily frowned slightly. She had always believed Daniel's parents had a strong, steady marriage. That was the story everyone told. "We looked perfect from the outside," Margaret continued. "We smiled at gatherings, we held hands at weddings. But inside the house, we were strangers for a long time." She spoke faster now, as if afraid she might lose courage. "Your father-in-law worked day and night. He wanted success. He wanted security. I respected that, but I was alone. I was young. I had just given birth. I did not recognize myself anymore." Emily listened closely, her chest tight. "I felt invisible," Margaret said. "Like I had disappeared into motherhood while he chased dreams." She stood up and walked slowly to the window, staring outside. "There were nights I cried quietly, so Daniel would not wake. Nights I wondered if this was the life I had chosen, or the life that had chosen me." Emily swallowed. She had felt that kind of loneliness before, small moments, never this deep, but enough to understand. "And then," Margaret said, her voice softer now, "someone noticed." The words hung in the air. "It was not planned," she continued quickly. "He was just a colleague of your father-in-law. He came over for dinner once. He asked me questions. Real questions. He listened." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I had not been listened to in years. Emily felt a quiet shock move through her. She did not interrupt. "He began calling." "Sometimes," Margaret said. "At first about simple things. Work matters. Then about books, music, life. He would ask how I was feeling. No one had asked me that in so long." Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "I told myself it was harmless, just conversation, just friendship." She turned to face Emily again. "But the heart is dangerous when it is lonely." The room felt warmer, harder to breathe in. "I started waiting for his calls," Margaret admitted. "I started dressing differently when I knew he might visit. I started imagining a life where someone looked at me the way he did. Emily's mind raced. She could not picture Margaret this way, young, uncertain, tempted by attention. Did you? Emily hesitated, then stopped. Margaret understood the unfinished question. No, she said firmly. I did not cross that line. Her eyes were steady, but I stood very close to it. Emily exhaled slowly. There was one evening, Margaret continued. Your father-in-law was out of town. Daniel was asleep. He came by to drop off some documents. We talked for hours. Her voice grew quiet. He told me I deserved more, that I was wasting myself, that I could choose a different life. Felt her stomach twist. For the first time, I considered leaving. Margaret said that the words fell hard between them. I imagined packing a suitcase, taking Daniel, starting somewhere new. She laughed softly, but it held no humor. I was foolish. Emily shook her head gently. You were hurting. Margaret looked at her, surprised by the softness in her reply. Yes, she whispered. I was hurting. She returned to her chair and sat down slowly. That night, when he left, I stood at the door for a long time. My heart was racing. I felt alive and ashamed at the same time. Emily could almost see the younger version of Margaret standing in the dim hallway, torn between desire and duty. The next morning, Margaret said Daniel woke up with a fever. He cried and reached for me. I held him, and something inside me changed. Her expression softened deeply. I realized I was about to break more than a marriage. I was about to break a family. The room grew still. I called him Margaret. Continued. I told him not to contact me again. Emily blinked. Just like that. It was not easy, Margaret replied. He argued. He said I was choosing comfort over happiness. But I knew the truth. She leaned forward slightly. Love is not just excitement, it is responsibility. It is sacrifice to staying when staying is hard. Emily felt those words settle deep in her chest. Your father-in-law never knew how close I came to walking away. Margaret said quietly. He never knew how lonely I was. Why didn't you tell him? Emily asked. Margaret smiled sadly. Because he was fighting his own battles. Pride, pressure, fear of failure. We were both too stubborn to admit we were drowning. She paused. Years later, we found each other again. Slowly, after Daniel grew older. After life slowed down. Her eyes softened with memory. We learned to talk, to listen, to forgive. Emily felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. So, you loved him? She asked gently. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Yes, deeply, but love changes shape over time. The confession hung between them, raw but honest, and Daniel. Emily asked carefully. Margaret's expression shifted. That is why I am telling you this. Emily's pulse quickened again. I see the way he looks at you lately. Margaret said. Emily froze. He is distracted, Margaret continued. Distant, just like his father once was. Emily felt heat rise in her face. He's just stressed. Maybe, Margaret said softly. Or maybe he feels unheard. The words struck deeper than Emily expected. I am not accusing him, Margaret added quickly. And I am not accusing you. Then why tell me? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Because silence creates space, Margaret said. And in empty space, temptation grows. The room felt too small. Now, I do not want you to learn the hard way, Margaret continued. Loneliness does not announce itself loudly. It builds quietly. It makes simple attention feel powerful. Emily thought about the late nights Daniel spent at work. The short replies, the way conversations ended quickly. Are you saying I am saying, Margaret interrupted gently, that every marriage reaches a crossroad. Her eyes filled with something close to fear. I stood at mine once. I chose to stay, but I almost did not. Emily felt her world tilt slightly. She had. always believed love either failed or succeeded clearly. She had never considered how close success could come to failure. Margaret reached out and held Emily's hand. "You are stronger than I was at your age," she said. But strength does not protect the heart from neglect. Emily did not pull away. "I am not proud of what I almost did," Margaret continued. "But I am proud that I stopped." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "I carried that guilt for years. I loved my husband, but part of me always remembered that moment at the door." Emily felt compassion rise within her instead of judgment. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Margaret nodded slowly, relief mixing with sadness. "I did not want to leave this world with secrets still alive," she said. "And I did not want you walking blind into the same storm." Outside, sunlight filtered through the window. Softer now, Emily stood up after a long silence. "I need to go home," she said. Margaret searched her face. "Are you angry?" "No," Emily replied honestly. "I'm thinking." Margaret gave a faint smile. "That is good. Thinking saves marriages." As Emily walked to the door, her mind raced, not with suspicion, but with awareness. She realized how fragile even strong love could be. How easy it was to drift apart without noticing. At the doorway, Margaret spoke. "One last time. Talk to him," she said. "Before silence talks for you." Emily nodded, taut. She stepped outside into the bright afternoon, her heart heavy but clear. Margaret's secret had not shattered her image of the past. It had revealed something more human. Love was not perfect. It was a series of choices, and sometimes the most important choice was made in the quiet moment before crossing a line. As Emily drove home, she knew one thing for certain. The real conversation was no longer behind her. It was waiting ahead.